Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Emma's Masterclass, Visa Essentials for Artist Managers. Lovely to see so many of you here. My name is Michelle Ronquillo, and I am Emma's event manager. Just a little bit about us. Within Emma, we unite music managers organization across 16 European countries, which represent more than 3,000 managers across Europe. We've made it our mission to strengthen European managers globally, through our Empower program, which encompasses education, advocacy, networking, and research. Empower is a project co-funded by the European Union. If you want to know more about us, or if you want to stay up to date with our upcoming events, make sure to visit our website, follow us on social media, sign up to our newsletter. I will put all the links in the chat in a little bit. Within the chat, there is also a general manager contact list that I will share upon request. Also, when you log off of Zoom at the end of the session, a super brief survey will pop up. Please take a moment to fill it out, as your feedback helps us massively to improve our upcoming events. I'm just going to share now the agenda of today. Please bear with me. Today's session is moderated by our Executive Director, Jess Patridge, and we are in really good company. Please remember to write your questions on the chat. And without further ado, let's get into it. Over to you, Jess.
Thanks so much, Michelle, and welcome everybody. And a huge welcome to our wonderful speakers. Thank you for joining us today. As most of you know, I'm Jess. I'm the Executive Director of Emma. I'm a little bit under the weather today, so I'm sorry if my voice is a little bit croaky and all over the place. I'll do my best. But yeah, today we're here to talk about visas, and it's an area that I feel like a lot of us feel like we need to know a lot more about. And just also to keep up to date with all the changes, because there have been some changes and there are constantly movements in these areas. So first of all, I would love each of my speakers to introduce themselves and then we'll get to it. I would also like to remind you all that this is a space for you. And if there's information you particularly want, make sure you ask it. This is an opportunity for you to really find out the answers to the questions you have. So put them in the chat at any point. I'll keep my eye on it. And yeah, we'll get as many of those questions answered as possible, because it really is super important that this time is as useful as possible for you. So in no particular order, or in screen order rather, Ian, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Some of you will know me, of course, and I'm dual-based UK and Vienna. Just saw Paulina pop up there, so hello, Paulina, from Vienna. I have been working for 25 years or longer, two agencies, etc., but also started a website after Brexit became a reality called UKEARTSWORK.info, pro bono site giving lots and lots and lots of information, both in terms of visas, visas for working creatives, and that includes working creatives and support staff, plus a YouTube channel, and work both in the UK and the EU in both directions, giving advice in both places. Also a registered licensed UKVI sponsor since 2009. Musician and all sorts of other things.
Wonderful, thanks so much. Matthew, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi. Thank you, Jess. My name is Matthew Covey. I'm the executive director of Thomasdot, which is a nonprofit based in Brooklyn, New York, that addresses a lot of issues related to artist mobility, specifically focused on the problems that artists face getting into the US. We both provide legal services for artists on specific case matters, but we also do a lot of advocacy work, working with the US government when they work with us and suing them when they don't, to try to make the artist visa process work better.
Great. And last but not least, Felix, if you can introduce yourself too.
Hello, I'm Felix. I work for a project that is called Touring Artists. We are based in Berlin, and we are an information and advisory service for artists that work cross borders, either being in Germany, going abroad, or being abroad and coming to Germany. Mostly for administrative topics, with a special focus on questions regarding visa questions, but also taxation, social security, and customs.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And Ian and Felix, if you could share the link to your website in the chat, that would be wonderful. There's a couple of requests, so that'd be good. And Tamzat's already in there. So thank you, Matthew. So to begin with, I really wanted to look at just the basics of the process. You know, when people were signing up to the session, a lot of people were just asking, like, what is the process? And we're really focused on the EU, UK, and US here, obviously, with the speakers that we have. So it would be great to get a little bit more insight into who needs visas, when you need a visa for the UK. Let's start with the UK. So anyone from Europe coming to the UK to do shows, who needs a visa, and what does a visa look like in that situation? I'm not sure who wants to jump in. Ian, you look like you're ready to go, so please do.
I think it's probably best I do this one. Okay, right. The question is not quite as simple as it might seem. So basically, it splits down into two types of nationals: non-visa nationals and visa nationals. If you hold an EU passport, or if you are from a number of countries around the world, you are a non-visa national. So you don't require a visa to come into the UK, even for work purposes, except in certain situations for long periods of time. So I'm going to go through this, and please do check the website. And if you want to send me questions later, that's fine. I do pro bono advice all the time on this. So the deal is this: if you are a non-visa national coming into the UK to work, you have effectively three routes. One route is totally free. The second route is free, and the third route you usually pay for. So first route, if you are not paid by a UK, before I say anything else, I'm going to give you what the reality is after I've spoken about this, and the reality at the border. Right, here we go. So if you are not paid by a UK entity or a UK individual for the work you're doing, you can enter without anything at all. If you're a non-visa national, you've got an EU passport. Not if you're resident in the EU, but got a different passport. So if you're a Georgian national or a Russian national, but you have right to work and to remain in the EU, it depends on your passport. So if you're not paid by a UK entity or a UK individual, you don't need anything. If you're coming in to a permit-free festival or event, you don't need anything, but you cannot be working anywhere else. For example, if you're working Glastonbury or Edinburgh Festival, etc., on the permit-free list, that's cool as well. Now, the one that I really only recommend if you are a full-time professional musician is what was the permitted paid engagement route into the UK. That means if you're coming in to work, you are supposed to identify yourself to an immigration official on entry. Don't go through the e-gates, the automatic gates, and say, excuse me, I'm a non-visa national. I want to work for up to 30 days. I have a letter of invitation. All good. Not if the immigration officer decides to impose upon you one of two conditions. One is that you have to be invited as an expert in your chosen profession, and it is not defined anywhere. So it's up to them. And the second being, if you must have been invited in your main job. So if you've got any other job at all, which is why I mentioned professional earlier, it's not a good idea. Many of you will have seen the German musicians, two different bands that got stopped at the borders last year. It was in The Guardian. I did interviews on Deutsche Welle and all sorts of other places, where the immigration officials decided, in fact, said to the people in question, you are not the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, therefore you cannot come in. We're detaining you for 6 hours, turned you around and sent you back again. Because they had other jobs, some of them, and they unfortunately said that to the immigration officials to try and make things easier. Not a good idea because of those two rules. The third way to come in is using a certificate of sponsorship from a UK registered licensed sponsor, which can be any of the venues they're playing, or someone like me as a third-party sponsor, who third-party sponsors usually charge a fee. The venues often will not. Sometimes they'll do it for free. And they will sometimes do it for everyone on a particular tour, although that you have to negotiate as a manager and say to the venue, any of the venues on the tour, are you a licensed UKVI sponsor? If they are, they can do the sponsorship for you. When you do that, you issue a certificate of sponsorship to the person. It's per person, not per band. They arrive at the border, they show the certificate to the UK border official. They should get their passport stamped and the certificate activated. That's the 3 ways to come in to the UK. The reality on the ground is the only surefire way is a certificate of sponsorship. Invitation letters have been used for years and years and years, and highly successfully, except over the last couple of years in particular, and certainly since Brexit, and certainly since COVID, a lot of immigration officials, border force as they're called in the UK, do not necessarily know their own legislation and have made big mistakes. I mean, without going into too much detail, we've got a folio, myself and someone called Steve Richards from TNS Immigration, many of you may know. We've got a folio of around about 15 pages of people like Ed Harris, the actor, being refused a stamp, half of Madonna's team being refused stamps. It's a nightmare. So there are 3 methods. So certificate of sponsorship, permitted paid engagement, invitation letter, and then not being paid by a UK entity or organization or individual. But there's one last thing I have to say. Permitted paid engagement visas, which were used for visa nationals, no longer exist. They haven't existed for quite some time. And what the UK government did, or rather UKVI did, was roll that into the standard visitor visa. If you are a national requiring a visa to get into the UK, as a creative, there are 2 choices. Standard visitor, whereby you do a standard visitor visa, it's cheap, it's £115, but you have to identify yourself to an immigration officer and say, for the first 30 days of my visa, I wish to work and I'm doing this, this, and this. There is no longer a PPE visa. This does not exist, which is why I was talking earlier about the problems of what really happens. The other visa that exists is the temporary worker creative visa, which can be from a few days up to a year, actually, if you can get a sponsor to sponsor you for that length of time. So permitted paid engagement visa or temporary worker creative visa, which requires sponsorship from a sponsor like me, or for that period of time. The standard visitor visa requires no certificate of sponsorship, but you do run the risk of when you appear at the port of entry, when questioned by an immigration official, you will have to potentially prove that you are a professional creative, and it's in their purview whether or not they let you in. No, sorry, it's lots of information, but there you go.
No, I think that's super useful, and obviously we're recording this so people will be able to go back through. But just there's a question in the chat, and I think it is really relevant here. So like, just to quickly go over it, so you're a German artist, EU passports, and you have been invited to play Womex or South by Southwest UK, and you're being paid by a UK entity.
Yeah.
What is the rule?
The rule is simple. If you are being paid by a UK entity, then your only 2 options are permitted paid engagement, invitation letter, or the certificate of sponsorship. The safest way is certificate of sponsorship. If you take the invitation letter route, you absolutely, if you want to be safe, must be a full-time musician or creative. Now, I sponsor drag artists, speakers, wrestlers, believe it or not, who come under arts and entertainment, not sport. Only when they're in the ring, and apparently when they're training, they're sports people, but who knows? No, the deal with that showcasing event, it doesn't matter what the event is. If you are being paid, then you can't take the I'm not being paid route. You either permitted paid engagement or COS route. The COS route is concession for non-visa nationals. If you're a visa national, you need a visa. End of.
And you talked about a permit list. Is there somewhere that
Yeah,
There's
I'll pull it up in a minute and put it on the
chat.
chat. It's actually quite limited, but one thing to say, please, if you're coming in for a permit-free event, this is only for non-visa nationals. You still need a visa if you're coming in for a permit-free event. Many people get confused about this, and you must only be playing permit-free venues when you come in on that. If they question you, or they occasionally look online when you come in, if they question you, you must only be doing that particular event. I'll put that in the chat now.
Thank you so much. So let's move to America. Well, not literally, because that's really hard. But Matthew, it would be great. There's obviously, especially around this time of year, people preparing for South by Southwest. There's a lot of questions on American visas and what is necessary, what the process is. Can you shed some light on this for us?
Yes and no. I will try to shed some light on it, although we could be here for days before we got into the nuances of it. So I'm not actually going to go too deeply into that.
Sure.
There are amazing resources in the world. I'm posting two of them now. There they are. Artists from Abroad is an incredible resource, largely in layperson speak, that explains a lot of the nuances of how the visa process goes for performing artists who need visas, who need employment-based visas to come to the US. And the second link there is Thomas.avail, which is our own pro bono legal assistance email hotline, which provides lawyers and legal professionals who can support and answer questions as they come up. These two resources are really important because I think one of the things that makes the US visa, artist, travel, mobility regime so complex is that there are just so many exceptions, and it's also a moving target. And the difference, in reference to what Ian said, the difference between what the law says and what the reality says is often quite extreme and fairly dangerous. So it's really important when you have a specific situation to find a person who can that you can work with to actually understand what the current situation of the moment is and make your plan based on that. That being said, there's two. I think the biggest question that people have to address when they're trying to figure out how to go to the US, the first question is, do I need an employment-based visa or do I not need one? Europeans typically can travel to the US on ESTA, which means it's not really getting a visa at all. You go online, you fill a little form, you pay $15, and you can go to the US. And usually that works fairly well. But what you're allowed to do under ESTA is quite limited. In general, it means you are coming to network, to attend meetings, to sign a contract, to do an interview. Those kinds of things are fine. There's a handful of other situations which are more complex, which are a gray area, where there are other things that artists can do in the US on ESTA, which might look like their work. And that's where a lot of the confusion comes up, is those things that you would think you'd need an employment visa for, but you actually don't. So I'm going to tick off two. But the problem with those exceptions, those narrow areas where you think you would need a visa, but you don't, the problem with those is that all of them are incredibly case specific. So it's not like I can't just sit here and say, hey, if you're going to play a showcase, you're fine, you don't need a visa, because the decision about whether to allow you into the US to play a showcase comes down to an individual officer at the airport deciding whether they believe you, and B, whether they've heard of the festival or the event that you're performing at, and what they had for breakfast. So all of these things will factor into whether they allow you in or not. So the process of trying to figure out, am I safe to send my artist to Folk Alliance? Am I safe to send my artist to Arts Midwest Conference? Am I safe to send my artists to South by Southwest? Am I putting them at risk or am I not? There is never 100% solid answer to that question. You just have to do the best you can, minimize your risks, working with the event, working with someone like myself or an immigration attorney to make sure make sure that you are taking care of your artists as best you can. The primary exceptions that are material to a Zoom call full of managers, the so-called showcase exception, which is an exception made by the US government for artists who are performing at an event which they consider to be more like an audition than a gig. The rule of thumb we usually say is that if an artist is coming to perform And the real reason that most of the people in the audience are there is not to be entertained, but to consider working with the artist in the future. If that's the case, then you may well be dealing with a bona fide showcase event situation, and it may be fine to do that without a visa. South by Southwest is a little bit of an exception in this area because the way the rule is articulated says literally if an artist is coming to the US to perform at a bona fide showcasing event like South by Southwest, then it's appropriate to travel as a tourist. It makes it easy for South by. It doesn't make it easy for the other showcase events. So if you hear of an event or your artist is invited to perform an event, the first thing to do is get good advice as to whether this would constitute a showcase or not. If it does, and if you get good advice that says that this is a showcase or is likely to be considered a showcase, then it's probably okay for them to travel on ESTA or on a tourist visa, provided they have documentation from the event that they can show to the officer at the airport, which explains why it's okay. And usually that works for an artist who's coming from Europe who hasn't, doesn't have other things in their record that might raise flags. But don't just decide, oh, I think this is a showcase, it's going to be fine, because that's a really risky decision as a manager to make. Another exception would be events that are being performed at universities or colleges may have an exception. You may not need a visa to do those, an employment-based visa to do those. Events that are being sponsored by your home government and are not ticketed in the US, those may be fine without a visa, but they may not be. Again, don't just make the decision yourself. Get help with that decision. We provide that help for free, so happy to help anybody who's trying to figure out, do I need a visa or not? The reason the decision is so important is if an artist travels on ESTA, you're going to be paying less than $15 per person to get that sorted, and they're going to be fine. If, in fact, it's determined that they need an employment-based visa, that's something that's going to take several $1,000s minimum, and somewhere between 2 and 7 months to get sorted out. And so obviously the investment in getting an employment-based visa is much higher. So when you're trying to make this decision, do I go with or without a visa? There's a strong incentive to avoid it, but it's also that's a risky perspective to take. Within the regime of employment-based visas, there's basically two types that most artists use. There's P visas, which are used by ensembles, and O visas that are used by solo artists. The O visas can last for up to 3 years, though they don't necessarily last that long. They last as long as the government decides you need it. P visas can last for up to 1 year, but can cover multiple people. It's really important if you're going to make that investment to make sure the duration of the visa is as long as possible. There are ways to get longer durations. Many agencies and attorneys that do this work for people aren't particularly invested in getting long-term visas because, for obvious reasons, they only get paid every time you come back to them. So if you've got a short visa duration, you're going to have to come back in a few weeks or a few months and they get paid again. So why would they try to get a long-term visa for you? But make sure that if you're going to go through the visa process to get a P or an O visa for your artist, make sure that you've explored what is the longest possible duration you can get for them so that you get your money's worth. The process is 2 parts. A petition gets filed in the US, which is effectively an application for a work authorization, where you have to prove that the artist is famous or important or culturally unique in some way. That's an art more than a science. And then you also have to prove that they have bona fide work. It doesn't have to be impressive work. It could be a home concert. It doesn't matter, but there has to be some sort of contractual reason for them to be in the US. Once you show that they are sufficiently important and sufficiently employable, the petition is filed with the US government in the US by a US entity who's representing you, the sponsor, if you wish. Once that petition is approved, the notification of the approval goes to the US embassy wherever the artist lives, and then they can actually apply for the proper visa in a separate process. That's the part 2. Historically, that second part of the process was kind of a rubber stamp. Since the pandemic, And since the Trump administration, that process has gotten much more complex. It's really impacted by dysfunctions at US embassies around the world, which often leads to delays, but it's also the profiling that goes into that process makes it much harder now than it used to be for artists from the global south or immigrant artists or artists who have criminal records or immigration issues in their history. It's now much more difficult. So the petition leads to a work authorization. When you have the work authorization, then you can apply for the visa. I think that's enough.
That's really great. And I think, yeah, it covers a lot of things. So basically, if you're going for a regular tour, you just need to apply for a visa pretty much. And
Pretty much.
if you're playing like South by, and I think the important thing to realize here is if you're playing South by and you're going on an ESTA, you really cannot play any other shows around that. Like
Right.
it's not like, oh, but we are playing this and these. It's like,
Yeah.
no, this is the only show. So I've seen
Yeah.
people go out on that before, and I've seen people they've changed the rules and made it much cleaner now, especially for South by. But you know, I've seen people sent home on Estes who were it
There
was
was part of their tour, for example,
yeah.
and they didn't realize that was a problem. I think one more thing I should say is a lot of people assume that if you're not getting paid for the gig, then that's not work. I mean,
Yeah.
why would it be work if you're not getting paid? And that is absolutely not how the US law works. It doesn't matter whether you're getting paid or not. You're still taking jobs away from American musicians, and that's what they're concerned about. So, in some
Right.
ways, not getting paid is worse than getting paid. So don't send your artist off to the US on a bunch of free promotional gigs and figure they don't need a visa, because that's going to cause them a lot of trouble.
Um,
Can I just jump in quickly, because something Matthew's just said is very relevant to something that happens in the UK. Taking jobs from musicians. We've just had a big argument with UKVI in the industry, in that because these are temporary work touring artists, they're not seen in the UK as taking jobs from UK musicians, for example. And the argument was UKVI, United Kingdom Visa and Immigration, insisted they were, and we have more or less won in saying that they're not. So just if you're making an application into the UK, that's not well, it's still
not how they
prevalent, but
do it.
it's not something that's actually true anymore.
Okay, great. Just quickly, Matthew, there's a couple of questions on the difference in cost between O visas and P visas. And also, this question, because it's a room full of managers, I particularly want to hear it answered. But a band touring the US with their manager, the band will need an O1 visa or a P1 visa, while the manager will need a business visa. What's it?
Good question. The US law makes a distinction between a road manager and a manager. A manager is somebody who's coming on the tour to do work that is not essential for the production of the tour. You're going to be with your artist at an important show in an important market, to network, to meet the agent, to meet the label, whatever it might be. You do not need an employment-based visa to do that. That's a business trip. So you can do that on ESTA, you can do that on a tourist visa. As soon as that artist, or as soon as that individual starts doing work that's related to the production of the tour, like advancing the shows, whatever it might be, then you should be considered a part of the crew, which means you need to have a crew. You need to be on the crew visa, which is a separate process, very similar to the artist process, but there's a separate visa classification for crew. The one thing that I would be careful about is if you are the manager and you're traveling with the artist, and the artists all have visas, have employment visas, and you don't, be careful about how you present yourself when you come into the border. If you look like the artist and don't fulfill their perception of what a manager looks like, you may be grilled, and they may presume that you're actually the road manager who didn't bother to get another visa.
Or in the band and just missed.
Or in the band and just like
Yeah,
didn't get to,
like
yeah, you're the
yeah.
drummer, right? So if that's the case, easy things to do. Make sure you go through immigration before the band does, and wait for them on the other side. That's an easy thing to do. Or travel through a different airport, or if they're driving from Canada, fly and meet them once they get to Boston. Just to make sure, or just be really careful what you say. Be ready to explain how your role is a management role, not a road management role.
Really good point. Thank you so much. Felix, I would love to look a little bit more at the EU situation, and especially with the UK, with us, like there's a lot of UK managers in the room right now. So, what is the process for UK now coming to EU? Now we're sadly out of the EU.
Yeah, maybe one thing to say at the very beginning is to make a differentiation between the EU and the Schengen area. These are two different things. So every EU citizen is allowed to travel within the EU as much as they want, and also within the Schengen area. But there are some countries that are part of the EU, but not part of the Schengen area. Ireland is, yeah, the one big example, I guess. And there are also other countries that are not part of the EU, but they are part of the Schengen area, especially Switzerland, Norway, and Iceland. So we have different areas, and it's sometimes important to not mix those up. Kind of similar to the UK and also to the US, I would say we have non-visa nationals and visa nationals. And non-visa nationals to enter the Schengen area basically nationals from, I would say, the so-called Western industrial countries, and also from a bunch of countries in South America. There are lists of that. So there are non-visa nationals that can enter the Schengen area and stay for the allowed amount of time, which is 90 days within 180 days. I'm going to talk about that in a bit. And then we have visa nationals, which is basically all the other countries, and they have to apply for a Schengen visa in advance. Maybe we can focus on the non-visa nationals first, because they are maybe the bigger part also regarding our guests in the room. First of all, 90 days within 180 days. What does that mean? Maybe that's a good question at the beginning. It means you can enter the Schengen area for a maximum of 19 days within 180 days, but always from a perspective that you look back at the last 180 days. So from each day that you are in the Schengen area, you should be able to look back for the past 180 days and say, I haven't spent more than 90 days here. This is sometimes a bit tricky. This is also tricky because sometimes people mix up private stays in the Schengen area with business stays in the Schengen area. They are all the same. Every stay in the Schengen area counts. And if you spend 2.5 months on your on a vacation on a Greek island, then go back to the UK and then want to enter again for a longer period of time, then you have to check like quite thoroughly if you don't cross the 90-day rule. I recommend to use the calculator from the EU Commission for that. It looks like a tool from the late 90s, but it works. It's, in my experience, the best tool to calculate it. We will have issues with overstays, I would say more in the future, because there is a new system coming in. It's called the electronic entry-exit system, which was supposed to be launched on November 10, and now it was postponed again. So this is postponed over and over again. And the idea is that every entry to the Schengen area and every exit will be tracked. And you don't have the stamps in the passports anymore, but you have the digital recorded stays. I talked to some people from the UK that told me, well, sometimes when I have to spend more than 90 days, I leave the Schengen area from this airport because they don't really check the stamps and they just put it in and it's fine. So this won't work anymore. So this was always risky, very, very risky. But this won't work anymore in the future. When will the entry-exit system be launched? We don't know. Maybe, presumably in the next 6 months, in the next 8 months. So this is what is expected to happen. We will also have a system that will be similar to ESTA. It's called ETIAS. It's a pre-registration system, which is also supposed to be better than ESTA. That's what they say at least, but we can have no idea about that. So we have the registration that has to be done first before you enter the Schengen area. But with that, obviously, there's also a broad set of data recorded that was not relevant before. So they will ask you a couple of questions that you have to answer before you can get the authorization. One thing is, for instance, that stays in war or conflict zones will be tracked. So you have to mention if you spend some time in a country that could be considered as a war or conflict zone. This ETS registration is supposed to work very quickly, so they are talking about same-day issuance. We will see if that really works. Yeah, there are a lot of open questions, both in regard of the ETS system that will come soon and also in regard of the entry-exit system. One thing is that we have bilateral agreements between some Schengen countries with other non-Schengen countries that allow you to stay on top of your Schengen stay. They're very old agreements, sometimes from the 50s, 60s. Now they work because we have the analog system, but we don't know if they will work with the electronic entry exit system.
Yeah.
So a lot of question marks about that. If you enter the Schengen area without a visa, you're allowed to stay the 90 days. You are basically not allowed to work. It's kind of like you are allowed to have business meetings or make contacts with people, but there's like basically the Schengen visa doesn't allow you to work. But every Schengen country has different national rules that define exemptions. And they are different in every Schengen country. They're similar sometimes, but also in terms of like legal approach, they are very different. For instance, Germany basically says, let's put it another way. A lot of countries say, okay, for artists who will have an exemption, they are allowed to work. They're allowed to work for 8 weeks, 3 months, different kind of exemptions in different countries. Germany has another approach. They say, well, if an artist performs at a festival, it doesn't count as work. So you're fine with your non-visa entry or with your Schengen visa entry because it doesn't count as work. So if you go on tour, if you go on tour in the Schengen area in different countries, you would technically have to check the individual laws of each country. But in general, like every country has this kind of exemption. However, the time spans can be very, very different. So this is something to check.
Yeah, can I just say, I'll put in the chat now, there's a page on the UKEARTSWORK.info site which defines each of the EU 27 with backlinks to the each of the EU 27's government agency sites. And as Felix has just said, every country has a different amount of time, which is free for creatives and in some cases, creative support workers. It's important to note something Felix just said, maybe misunderstood. Because once you're in the Schengen area, generally speaking, there are no borders. So you're not going to get checked at border to border to border about whether you're working. And then there are different regulations about whether or not you report that work in those particular countries. So I shall just pop that in now. And that is there. So that's a backlink to all the different countries that Felix was referring to, but does not include Switzerland. Sorry. Oh, it does, but we did it recently, so I'm not sure how up to date that is. And then you've got things that are part of the extended universe, like relating to other things. Thank you. Sorry.
No worries. That's perfect. But yeah, Felix.
Yeah, thank you very much for sending that. Yeah. Yeah. Also, maybe in addition to that, we have very, very little test cases on that, like court cases. It's very different probably to the US. So people do a lot of different kind of works, which in our eyes is maybe not be part of what the law allows, but they're doing this and there hasn't been cases. So I would argue that the gray zone is much broader than in the US or maybe in the UK.
But it's impossible to check it,
Yeah,
Felix, isn't it? Really, that's the problem. That's the
yeah,
reality.
it's impossible. Yeah, that's one of the realities. Yeah. If you want to stay in the Schengen area for longer than 19 days, you will need a national visa. For instance, UK citizens can enter the Schengen area, one specific country, and in most countries apply for a residence permit from that place. For instance, they can come to Berlin and then apply for a residence permit here. But they can also apply for a national visa at the embassy in London, which I would actually recommend to do because this can be way quicker. And then as soon as you arrive, you're allowed to work. If you are here and you apply for a residence permit, this can take ages. And in the meantime, you might not be allowed to work or do stuff that you want to do. We had a lot of cases from musical tours that were longer than 90 days, or when the Brexit came, they needed this type of national visa. What is interesting here is if you have a national visa for Germany, for instance, and maybe it's for a tour, and sometimes they issue that for 4 or 5 months if it's longer than 90 days. Then you have the national visa for Germany. On top of that, you have 90 days within 180 days in any other Schengen country.
Can I just say something here,
So
Felix?
like additionally,
Yeah.
I think it's important, something you said earlier that I just remembered about passports and also entering the Schengen area or for the 1980 days. By the way, everyone, the 1980 days sits on top of all those other allowances. It's not in addition to or separate. So that's how long you're allowed to be in there. So if you've gone beyond your 1980, you can't go in and take advantage of those 3 days for work as a creative if you're out of your 18180. So one thing that Felix said earlier, which is really important because I found this out very, very recently, is that we had a lot of people in the industry. I've got 2 passports. I can use 2 passports and use one, and it doesn't matter. It does. They'll catch you. But the other thing is, if you're dual national, the Schengen allowance is not per passport. It's an individual allowance related to the person. So I only found this out very recently, and it was a really interesting question because people were saying, "Well, I'm Argentinian and British, for example." It doesn't make any difference because when ETIAS comes in and the EES system comes in, that is going to get rid of all of that potential for getting around the system, and that's not going to be too long into the future. I just wanted to jump in with that passport citizenship thing and individual. It's an individual allowance, not passport related allowance, except if you're a visa or non-visa national. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt, Felix.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, there was one question in the chat I saw going to the EU as a manager traveling with their artists.
Yeah, creative support worker.
It's in most of the cases it's always part of the law, so this is usually not an issue within the specific time frame. Yeah. I would jump to the visa nationals, which are also great number of people that need a visa to enter the Schengen area. This is very tricky, and it's getting worse each year because the number of rejections are rising, and specifically, obviously for artists, for young artists, that is a huge issue. We have the same problems as the US, so a lot of embassies, especially since COVID work very slowly. We have a lot of delays. There are some embassies that don't work at all. We have in some countries, not the embassies dealing with that, but agencies that are paid by the embassies, which sometimes can be really shady, and there have been very bad examples in the past. If you have to get a Schengen visa, first of all, the question is, which embassy do you apply to? And there is a rule that has been changed like 2 or 3 years ago, I guess. Before that, it was that you had to get the Schengen visa from the country where your trip was about to start. This now changed, so you can apply for a Schengen visa at the embassy where the important part of your travel will be. And this is fairly arguable because you can say, well, I'm playing concerts in Germany, but I'm also visiting my family in France. And this is the more important part. And this could technically work. People do that because the rejection rates from embassies for different citizens are different. So sometimes there are Schengen statistics, and there is a lot of evaluation about this Schengen statistics. So what people sometimes do is they say, well, I'm from this country. France is good at issuing visas for my country for some reasons. And they apply for the visa at the French embassy, although a large part of the tour will happen in Germany. It works, and there is until now not so many cases of issues, but you have to be well prepared at the border because they might ask those questions, especially if you enter through another country. Most important point of the Schengen application is not to show that you have enough money to spend the time in the Schengen area, but to prove that your willingness to return is high enough. And that's the interesting question. How do you prove that you plan or that you intend to leave the Schengen area after your stay? Our experience is that the best way to prove that is to show duties that you have outside of the Schengen area after your stay. So when you say,
Right.
I'm going to play a couple of festivals, and then I have to be in the UK because I have a show in the UK, and then I have to go to the US, and then my sister is getting married back in India. Then you have a perfect portfolio to show you have to be outside of the Schengen area at a specific point. Our experience is that most of the applications are rejected because they show little proof of that. Also, it's not as specifically at the application. And this is especially important for young male artists that are not married and don't have kids. That is where the rejection rate is the highest, and for them it's really, really important to show this material.
Thanks so much, Felix. That's a really useful point and a good overview. There's only 10 minutes left, so if you have your questions, now is the time to get them in. But in the meantime, and thank you, Matthew, for answering all the questions in the chat. There's a lot of questions in the chat that he's actually written answers to, so I really recommend having a read through, and we'll make sure that we get that chat to you afterwards as well. But yeah, I wanted to just clarify a little bit. So if you're a UK artist, you've got a tour that goes through like 3 Schengen countries. How you have to individually check each of those countries' requirements, right? That's basically what you're saying. And Ian, you've linked to basically what they are already.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a really simple answer to that question. Check what's required in law, and in reality, it's unlikely anyone will ever be checked because it's actually supposed to be the promoter or the local organizer that is generally supposed to report said work. But if you're in the Schengen area, check that you're legal, stay legal. I always say that, but in reality, whether it's checked or not depends. Often it's checked through, for example, in Austria, you have to, there's a legal requirement for the promoter to make sure that people don't earn more than 2,000 euros per year in the country, so they have to fill out a form, for example. But it's that's certainly been my experience. One thing, I'll just answer a couple of really quick ones that were in the chat. Russians and Georgians, etc., coming into the UK at the moment, there are enhanced checks, and it is still possible to get a visa. It's not, well, I say it's not a problem. It just takes a bit longer. And also, somebody asked about being a Canadian and the Commonwealth. It makes no difference. Sorry, it's just the same. You're a non-visa national. That's it. And there are questions about merchandise, etc., which I won't go into. But one thing I will say in the chat in a minute, I'm going to link a video that has resources underneath it on the portables exemption for you to bring musical instruments in and out of both the UK and the EU without the requirement for a carnet. It was expanded a while ago, but I'm going to pop that in there now to avoid having to talk about it later. Thank you.
Okay, that's great because carnets, we could probably do a whole other session on carnets and taking merch and equipment across borders for sure. There's a couple of questions around the recording, like if you're recording in another country. So Felix, do you think you could expand just so that we have it in the video as well? But if you're a recording artist and you want to go from the UK to Germany to use a special studio, what are the rules around this? If you're staying for maybe maximum 30 days.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because it's so here again we have a case that is not part of the law. So the exemptions in Germany are for very well-known artists presenting, for festivals, guest performances, and up to 15 one-day shows within a year that are not part of festivals, etc. So technically, this is not really encompassed in the law, but practically, I could not imagine this being an issue. Like, first of all, the question would be, how can that be checked? And then secondly, you can have a very broad interpretation of that law. And this is something that is done in practice by thousands of people, and it has never been an issue. But I would say it's not fully part of the law in Germany.
Okay, great. So, well, not great, a little less clear, but shouldn't be an issue. It should be totally fine.
It's similar in the UK, by the way. Very similar in that it's considered if you're coming in to work on an album yourself, for you're self-employed. You're not being paid to do that. Therefore, you're coming in to take advantage of a facility in the UK to do your recording. Maybe if you can afford it, Abbey Road or somewhere. So I get this question a lot. And if you're just coming in to do that, then the safe way is a cause anyway. But it means you don't have to have the argument with the border official about why you're coming in. And everyone says, oh, but if you're carrying an instrument, generally speaking, unless you've got it in the cabin with you, it's the other side anyway, after immigration control. So we get that as well. But it's very similar to what Felix has said in the UK, if anyone's asking that.
Interesting. And Matthew, what about for the US if an artist was coming over to record?
I just popped an answer into the chat. If the artist is coming to record pursuant to a contract with a US entity, that's working and they need an employment-based visa. If they're coming to the US to record pursuant to a contract with a non-US entity, the general thinking is you're coming to the US to spend money, not to make money, and you don't need a visa for that. How that works in reality in terms of how you prove who you're working for is another question, but that would be a good question to follow up with us if you're looking for advice on that.
But if
Jess,
so
sorry, mega important, something that was said ages ago by Felix, and I didn't say about calculating your time in Schengen, 1900 days work backwards. Weirdly, in the agreement between the UK and the EU, the UK calculates it differently if you're going into the UK to work. It calculates it as a single block of time. Whereas in the EU, you always count 180 days back of the 1980 days from that point. UK, it's just a block of time. Sorry, I just need to say that because it confuses everybody.
It's very, very confusing. Yes, there's another question in the chat which has come up about TAJ-A1 forms, which hopefully Matthew can shed some light on, which I'm sure he's...
I can.
You can. Okay, Ian, go for it.
Sadly, yeah. And this is happening a lot in Spain at the moment. For those of you that don't know, Spain actually didn't allow any creative free periods of time for creatives until quite recently, well, last year, where they brought it into line. The only creatives they had at that time were for film industry. And then they allowed it to be expanded. I don't mean for EU nationals, obviously, but for non-EU nationals. They then expanded it after conversations with UK Musicians Union and Live to include everybody. This relates to, it's happened a lot recently about related to A1 forms as well, which is about national insurance. I cannot answer this in any great detail except to say it is happening, and you really need to talk usually to an accountant in order to properly deal with that. So I'm not batting it away, but this will take a long time to discuss, but it's related to A1 forms as well.
Okay, great.
So
Thank
no,
you. Yeah, that's
no, I can't.
so that's a
There you
slightly
go.
different conversation. So we only have a few minutes left, so I just wanted Felix, go for it.
Maybe since we were talking about the A1 formula, one thing that was not taken part of the UK when Brexit happened was the coordination with the social security within the EU. So you can go as a EU citizen or someone who lives in the EU. No, you have to be EU citizen, go to the UK and stay in your EU social security and just use the A1 formula and vice versa. And this is one very, very tiny part that hasn't been taken away after Brexit.
One very small part. Yeah, thank you. Important, they're crucial. So yeah, I just wanted to ask if there's anything, tips, like things that you quickly want to add before we sign off. Also, Matthew, it would be great to hear about time scales. Like, what are we looking at for applying for a visa at the moment?
There was a question about the election above, and I just that's who knows? Who knows? I mean, will there even be a United States in January? I don't know. But in terms of time frame, under normal circumstances, if you're trying to avoid expediting fees, you should be starting the process 6 months out if you can. Even if you don't have the entire tour booked, you should be talking with the people that you're going to be working with. But that being said, certainly if it's a career deal breaker gig and you have 3 weeks to put it together, it may be worth a try. If you have to, it's going to cost an arm and a leg. Right now, there are some major issues with the actual administrative processing in the US on the petition side, and we're seeing some major delays, so much so that under certain circumstances, it's just basically the premium processing $2,805 fee is just simply a given. You have to do it. In other situations, it's not. And unfortunately, it's just a flip of a coin whether you're going to have to pay that or not, which is appalling, but it's the way things are right now. Hopefully that will change soon. But under normal circumstances, 6 months, 5 months out is where you want to be thinking about. You want to be thinking and planning ahead and getting the process rolling.
Great, that's not as bad as I thought it was, but still difficult for sure. Ian, is there anything you wanted to add just quickly before we go?
Real quick, yeah, in relation to what Matthew just said as well, for visa nationals, it's around 5 to 6 weeks at the moment, lead time. It's not at the moment, it changes all year round. So be clear that that's all I'm saying at the minute. And the other thing to say, there are lots of videos on the YouTube site that I sent links into my YouTube site. It's constantly updated. But the other thing, somebody asked a thing about merch earlier. Merchandise across UK EU borders anyway. No, you can't post it. It makes no difference. You still have to do a customs declaration. The best possible way of doing this is if you're on a UK EU tour and even coming in from America or anywhere else, get some merch made in the UK, get some merch made in the EU if you can afford this, so you don't have to cross the borders. Otherwise, you're going to have to do, at the very least, a simple customs declaration. And if you've got anything like T-shirts that are made outside UK EU, then you have to follow rules of origin, which means a full customs declaration. It's a pain in the ass.
Okay.
So try and get it
done separately. Thank you so much. Felix, anything very quickly to add before we go?
If you invite third country nationals that need a visa and you have political contacts, make use of them.
Totally.
Great shouts. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much to all three of you. This has been so interesting. Everyone, we will be obviously putting this on our YouTube as normal. Make sure you subscribe. And we'll be sending the links and the chat out to everyone because there's so many great answers in it. Yes, don't forget to answer the questionnaire when you leave, and we will see you next time. Check our events. We've got some great ones coming up. Thank you so, so much. Bye.
Take care, everyone.